The last reel. The wind cut across the Nebraska prairie like a cold blade, rattling the bare branches of the cottonwoods that lined the road to Willow Creek Cemetery. Harold Hal Whitaker stood at the edge of the grave, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his threadbare overcoat, his gray hair whipping in the gusts. At 78, his knees ached from decades of climbing the narrow stairs to the projection booth, his fingers gnarled from threading film reels through ancient machines. But the pain in his chest, sharp and unrelenting, had nothing to do with age. It was the loss of Marlene, his wife of 50 years, taken by a heart attack 3 days ago. She had been the heart of their small town's only cinema, the Starlight Theater, and the heart of Hal's world. Now, as her casket was lowered into the frozen earth, he felt like the reel of his life had snapped mid-frame. The Starlight had been their life's work, a 1940s gem with faded velvet seats and a marquee that still flickered on Friday nights. Hal had run the projector, his hands steady as he coaxed 35mm films to life, while Marlene sold tickets, popped corn, and charmed every patron with her warm laugh. "You make the magic, Hal," she'd say, her eyes crinkling as she handed him a coffee in the booth. "I just keep the lights on." He had believed her, had built his life around her, giving up a chance to work in Omaha's bigger theaters to stay in Willow Creek, where Marlene loved the open skies and the quiet rhythm of small-town life. The church was packed for the funeral, the air thick with the scent of chrysanthemums and damp wool. Hal stood at the entrance, nodding as neighbors offered condolences, their faces blurred by his grief. He wore his only suit, a navy pinstripe Marlene had picked out for their 40th anniversary, now tied across his shoulders. Inside, the pews creaked under the weight of the town farmers, shopkeepers, kids who'd grown up sneaking into the Starlight's balcony. Hal sat in the front row, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the oak casket draped in white roses. His grandson, Caleb, stood at the pulpit. At 29, Caleb was a sound engineer in Lincoln, his lanky frame and dark eyes, Marlene's eyes, filled with sorrow. Hal had raised Caleb after his parents died in a car crash when Caleb was 5, teaching him to splice film, to love the hum of the projector. Caleb was the closest thing Hal had to a son. Caleb's voice trembled as he spoke of Marlene's kindness, her love for the Starlight, her ability to make everyone feel like they belonged. Hal waited for him to mention him, to acknowledge the life he and Marlene had built, the nights they'd stayed late to clean the theater, the years they'd poured their savings into keeping it alive. But then Caleb's voice broke, and he paused, his gaze shifting to the second row. "There's someone I need to thank," he said, his words heavy with emotion. "Someone who was Grandma's true heart, who gave her light in her final years." Ruth Lang. The name hit Hal like a physical blow. A murmur rippled through the church, and all eyes turned to a woman in her mid-50s, rising briefly from her seat. Ruth's silver-streaked hair was pulled into a loose bun, her charcoal dress elegant but understated, her eyes glistening with delicate tears. Hal's breath caught. Ruth Lang had been an usherette at the Starlight decades ago, a quiet girl who'd left town to study film restoration in California. She'd returned 5 years ago, helping Marlene catalog old reels in the basement. Hal had thought nothing of it, grateful for the help, dismissing Ruth as a passionate cinephile. Marlene had invited her to their home for dinners, her hospitality as warm as ever. Now, as Ruth sat down, her composure unshaken, Hal felt the world tilt. Ruth was there for Grandma when she needed someone most, Caleb continued, his voice steadying. She understood her, gave her a place to dream again. She was family. The word landed like a stone in Hal's chest. Family. Not him, not the man who had spent half a century with Marlene, who had sold his prized 16mm camera to cover her medical bills when her heart weakened, who had sat by her bedside reading her old movie scripts aloud. Hal's hands tightened in his lap, his knuckles white. He felt the eyes of the congregation shift, not to him, but past him, as if he were a shadow in his own story. The service ended, and Hal moved through the crowd like a ghost, shaking hands, murmuring thanks. He saw Caleb approach Ruth, their embrace lingering, and something in him cracked. He wanted to demand answers, to ask Caleb what he meant, but the weight of grief held him silent. He drove home alone, the prairie road stretching endlessly under a gray sky, the silence in his old Ford truck deafening. The Starlight Theater loomed on Main Street, its marquee dark, the letters spelling out "closed until further notice." Hal and Marlene's home was a small apartment above the lobby, filled with the scent of popcorn and old film. That night, Hal sat in their living room, the air heavy with Marlene's absence. Her knitting basket sat untouched by the sofa, her favorite mug still on the counter. He poured himself a bourbon, the burn doing little to dull the ache. He wandered into the projection booth, a narrow room at the top of a creaking staircase, where reels of film lined the walls. Classics like Casablanca, The Wizard of Oz, and local shorts had shot of Willow Creek's fairs and parades. Marlene had loved this space, had called it his soul. Now, it felt like a crypt. The next morning, Hal sat in the office of Marlene's lawyer, Mr. Ellison, a stooped man with a voice like dry leaves. The room smelled of ink and old wood, a single window letting in pale light. As per Marlene Whitaker's will, signed 3 years ago, Ellison began the estate, including the Starlight Theater, the savings, and all intellectual property rights to Harold Whitaker's films, are bequeathed to Ms. Ruth Lang. Hal's world stopped. The words echoed, each one a betrayal. He stared at Ellison, waiting for a correction, a mistake. But the lawyer continued, detailing minor bequests to the Historical Society. Nothing for Hal, nothing for Caleb. Hal turned to his grandson, seated beside him, his face calm. "You knew," Hal whispered, his voice rough. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't need Hal's eyes. "Grandma had her reasons," he said softly. "Ruth was there for her. She understood her passion for film, her dreams. You were always up in the booth, Grandpa." The accusation cut deeper than the will itself. Hal stood, his legs unsteady, and walked out into the cold morning. The prairie air was sharp with the scent of frost and earth, the town quiet under a thin layer of snow. 50 years of marriage, of shared reels and late-night talks, erased in a single document. And Caleb, the boy he'd raised, had known. Had chosen Ruth. Back at the Starlight, Hal sat in the darkened auditorium, the velvet seats empty, the screen a blank void. He thought of the sacrifices he'd made, turning down a job with a Lincoln cinema chain to keep the Starlight running, using his savings to repair the projector when it broke. He'd filmed through Marlene's illnesses, believing his reels gave her joy. Had it all been a lie? When had Marlene stopped seeing him as her partner? Desperate for answers, Hal returned to the projection booth. He hadn't threaded a reel since Marlene's death, the machine silent, the reels untouched. As he sorted through old canisters, he found a locked metal box tucked behind a stack of Gone with the Wind prints, one he didn't recognize. He pried it open with a screwdriver, revealing a single 35mm reel labeled in Marlene's handwriting, "For Hal, when I'm gone." His hands shook as he held it, the weight of it heavier than any film he'd ever carried. He needed to see it, but the Starlight's projector was old, its parts worn. He called Lena, a film student from the community college who'd volunteered at the theater, her enthusiasm for cinema a spark in Willow Creek's fading light. "I found something," Hal said, his voice rough. "A reel. I need your help to screen it." Lena arrived the next day, her backpack stuffed with tools, her eyes bright despite the grim task. She studied the reel, her fingers tracing the label. "This is Marlene's," she said softly. "She was restoring films, wasn't she? Why didn't she tell you?" Hal didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the reel. Lena set up the projector, her hands steady as she threaded the film. The booth hummed to life, the light flickering through the window onto the screen below. The reel began with static, then Marlene's face appeared, younger, her smile radiant against a backdrop of the Starlight's marquee. "Hal," she said, her voice clear through the speakers, "if you're watching this, I'm gone. I need you to understand." The image cut to scenes of Willow Creek parades, sunsets, the theater's opening night in 1955. But then it shifted to Ruth, laughing in a restoration lab, her hands delicate as she cleaned a nitrate print. Marlene's voice continued, softer now. "Ruth gave me something I didn't know I needed, a chance to save the films we love. But it came at a cost." Hal's heart pounded as the reel unfolded. It showed Ruth and Marlene in a hidden basement archive beneath the theater, shelves lined with restored classics, Sunset Boulevard, Singin' in the Rain films Hal thought were lost. Marlene's voice grew heavy. "I used the theater's profits, Hal. I know it was wrong, but the Starlight was dying. Ruth had a plan to save it, to make it a restoration hub. I thought I was protecting our dream." The final shot was Marlene alone, her eyes wet. "I loved you, Hal. Always. But I got lost. Forgive me. The reel ended, the screen going dark. Hal sat frozen, the booth's hum the only sound. Lena's eyes were wide, her voice barely a whisper. She was hiding a whole archive, she said. But those profits, they were yours too. Hal's hands trembled as he rewound the reel. Marlene's confession was a knife, love, betrayal, and sacrifice twisted together. Had she been saving the theater, or building a new life with Ruth? He dug deeper, scouring the basement with Lena's help. They found ledgers hidden behind a false panel, detailing transfers to a company called Silver Screen LLC. The numbers were staggering, hundreds of thousands siphoned over a decade, funneled into the archive and a small cabin outside town. Hal remembered Marlene's restoration trips to Omaha, her late nights he'd attributed to passion for the theater. He found a letter from Ruth, dated 2 years ago. The cabin is ours, March. Our sanctuary for the films. The cabin was a place Hal and Marlene had picnicked early in their marriage, a spot they dreamed of retiring to. Had it been theirs and Ruth's all along? Hal hired a lawyer, Margaret Klein, a sharp woman in her 60s who specialized in fraud. Her office was a cramped space above the town's diner, the air suite with the scent of pie. Hal laid out the reel, the ledgers, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Marlene left everything to Ruth, he said. But this reel, these records, they're proof she stole from the Starlight. I want it back. Margaret studied the evidence, her expression unreadable. This is fraud, potentially, she said. We can challenge the will, but Hal, this will expose Marlene's secrets. It could break Caleb. Are you ready for that? Hal thought of Caleb's words at the funeral, of Ruth's poised grief. I need the truth, he said. I've been in the dark too long. The lawsuit took months to prepare. Hal and Lena cataloged the archive, uncovering more reels, restored films worth thousands, funded by the Starlight's profits. One reel showed Ruth and Caleb, barely 20, laughing in the basement, Marlene's voice calling them my dream team. Hal's stomach twisted. Ruth hadn't just taken Marlene, she'd woven herself into Caleb's life. He thought of the bookstore events where Ruth had charmed patrons, her hand on Marlene's arm, their laughter a private language. Had Marlene loved her? Had Hal been blind to his wife's heart? The trial began on a bitter March morning, the courtroom a stark contrast to the Starlight's warm glow. Ruth sat across the room, her face composed, her lawyer arguing that the transfers were gifts, that Marlene had every right to her choices. But Margaret was relentless, screening the reel, presenting the ledgers, the property records. Hal took the stand, his voice raw as he spoke of his marriage, his love for Marlene, the shock of her betrayal. Mr. Whitaker, Margaret asked, what did it mean to you, learning your wife left her estate to Ms. Lang? Hal looked at Caleb, seated in the back, his eyes fixed on the floor. It meant I'd lost her long before she died, he said. I thought we were partners, that the Starlight was ours. But I was projecting someone else's dream. The judge, a grizzled man with a kind but firm demeanor, ruled in Hal's favor. The transfers were deemed fraudulent, the archive and cabin ordered returned to the estate, to be redistributed to Hal. Ruth's composure cracked as the gavel fell, her eyes flashing with something like fear. She left without a word, her silhouette vanishing into the snow. Hal expected relief, but the victory felt hollow. Caleb hadn't spoken to him since the funeral, hadn't answered his calls. He returned to the Starlight, the reel still scattered across the booth. He screened Marlene's reel again, her face filling the screen, her voice a ghost. I loved you, Hal. Always. He wondered if she'd meant to save the theater, or if she'd been saving herself. One evening, as Hal sat in the auditorium, the prairie outside blanketed in snow, Caleb appeared at the door. His coat was dusted with frost, his face pale. Can we talk? He asked, his voice small. They sat in the booth, the reels around them like silent witnesses. I didn't know, Caleb said, his eyes wet. I thought Ruth was helping Grandma save the theater. I didn't see what she was doing. I'm sorry, Grandpa. Hal's throat tightened. He thought of the boy who'd called him Grandpa with a grin, who'd fallen asleep in the booth during late-night screenings. I loved her, he said. But I didn't see her, not really. Maybe I was too busy running the projector. Caleb reached for his hand. She loved you too. She told me your films were her home. I think she just got lost. They sat in silence, the projector's hum a quiet comfort. Hal felt the weight of his grief shift, not gone, but lighter. He was no longer just Marlene's husband, Caleb's grandfather, or Ruth's pawn. He was Harold Whittaker, a man who had lost everything and found himself in the flicker of his own reel. He began screening films again, classics at first, then his own shorts of Willow Creek's people. The town came alive, filling the seats, their laughter echoing. Caleb started visiting, helping restore the archive, sharing stories over popcorn. One spring evening, as they walked the prairie, Hal handed him a montage of Marlene, laughing in the ticket booth, her eyes bright with life. For you, he said. So we don't forget her. Caleb hugged him, tears falling. You're my family, Grandpa, he said. Always. As the sun set, painting the prairie in hues of gold and amber, Hal felt a spark of something new. He was 78, weathered by loss, but alive. The reel of his life was his to thread, and for the first time in years, he knew the story he'd tell. Moral of the story: the truth, though it shatters illusions, is the light that guides us to rebuild what matters most. Hal's journey shows that facing betrayal with courage, and choosing love over resentment, allows us to preserve the legacy of those we've lost and find new frames for our own story.